In a palace shimmering with secrets and whispered cruelties, a bored prince taunts a quiet cleaning maid with an impossible challenge. "If you play Mozart, I'll marry you." But when her fingers dance across the harpsichord keys with breathtaking elegance, she ignites a scandal that shatters the walls between privilege and truth. Forced to confront her hidden past and the deadly intrigue of court politics, both prince and maid must risk everything, discovering that true love can rise from the ruins of reckless promises. The sun had risen pale and filtered behind a veil of morning mist, casting a soft silver light over the sprawling grounds of Château de Verre. The air smelled faintly of crushed lavender and damp stone, while the tiled corridors echoed with the muted footfalls of servants beginning the day's work. Lanterns still flickered in sconces along the hallways as maids in stiff aprons swept past one another in silence, communicating only through glances. In the salons, embroidered curtains had already been drawn open, letting in enough light to dance across the polished marble floors and gilded moldings that framed the high ceilings. The palace stirred not with noise, but with the quiet, methodical rhythm of ritual, layers of refinement woven into every breath, every step, every glance. Geneviève had been awake since before the sun, her hands raw from scrubbing hearths with lye soap. Her fingers were chapped from yesterday's laundry, and her nails still held the faint scent of ash. The scent clung to her, no matter how hard she scrubbed. She moved soundlessly, her wooden-soled shoes barely grazing the floors as she entered the music salon, the grandest chamber she was assigned to clean. Here, the air always smelled faintly of rosewater and varnished wood. Crystal chandeliers loomed overhead like suspended frost. The salon was already set for the afternoon. Velvet cushions arranged just so, harpsichords gleaming, music stands aligned like soldiers before battle. She dropped to her knees and reached for her pail, the cold water sloshing against the rim. The floor tiles were chilled beneath her, even through her skirts. She worked in careful circles near the legs of a carved settee, the bucket of water resting beside her elbow, and the bristles of the brush coarse against the inlaid patterns. Above her loomed portraits of noblemen with powdered wigs and narrowed gazes. They seemed to watch her. Everyone always seemed to watch. She kept her head down, as she'd been taught to do. The rustle of silk came before the voices. A small group of courtiers filtered into the salon, laughing behind fans, their footsteps trailing the scent of amber and expensive tobacco. They made no note of her presence. She was invisible. It was better that way. But the atmosphere shifted when another presence entered the room. The laughter paused, as if waiting to be given permission to resume. Then came the crisp clack of heeled boots across the marble, precise, unhurried, familiar. Prince Charles-Édouard de Vallon had arrived. The air shifted, subtle and unmistakable. Geneviève kept her gaze firmly on the floor as she dipped the brush into the water again. She didn't need to look up to know he'd claimed the nearest chair with the indolent grace of someone born to command the attention of any room he entered. The son of the king's younger brother, Charles, had been raised within reach of power but without the burden of inheritance. The court loved him, or said they did, and feared him in equal measure. Not for his temper, which was rarely seen, but for his unpredictability, for the way he could turn kindness into mockery without raising his voice, for the way he could listen to a person's soul and then, with surgical precision, decide exactly where to press until they fractured. He was beautiful, of course. That kind of beauty which did not age but sharpened. High cheekbones, full mouth, and eyes the color of wet stone. But it was not his face that unsettled people. It was the stillness, the intensity. He did not fidget or adjust his cuffs unnecessarily. When he looked at someone, they knew it. Geneviève could feel his attention on her now. It prickled across her shoulders, as if someone had brushed her skin with the edge of a feather. The conversation in the salon had resumed, but more carefully now, shaped for his amusement. Laughter came in cautious bursts. Then, too suddenly, it stopped again. There was a pause. The air held its breath. She scrubs as if she's trying to erase sin itself, said the prince's voice, cool and amused. It wasn't addressed to her, but it sliced just as deeply. The courtiers chuckled, uncertainly. Geneviève kept her eyes lowered. The rhythm of her hand over the brush remained steady. Another voice chimed in, a lady's, laughing too loudly. "Do you suppose she can read music, Your Highness?" "Doubtful," he replied. "She looks like she's never read anything at all." Geneviève reached for more water. Her fingers had begun to ache from the pressure of the brush. She did not wince. There was a beat, long enough to signal that he was bored again. The mood shifted. Then came the words that would change everything. "If she can play Mozart," Charles said idly, "I shall marry her." It was a joke, of course. The room erupted into delighted gasps, then laughter, high-pitched, cruel, theatrical. Someone clapped. Another asked which Mozart piece she'd need to play to earn a royal husband. The prince leaned back, lazily. The game pleased him. He didn't expect anything to come of it. None of them did. But Geneviève paused. Her fingers hovered over the bucket for a fraction of a second longer than they should have. The sound of laughter began to fade. The last notes of it thinned like perfume in the air, as the others began to realize she was rising. Slowly she stood, hands wet, skirts damp from kneeling. She looked neither timid nor proud. Her eyes remained downcast, but her shoulders squared, and without speaking, she turned and approached the harpsichord. It wasn't the grandest instrument in the room. There were two others, more ornate, but this one, with its darker wood and carved legs, was the most finely tuned. Geneviève stepped behind it, her fingers still dripping, and reached for the lid. The salon fell completely silent. The prince watched her, eyebrows slightly raised. If he was amused, the expression didn't quite reach his mouth. The court didn't understand what they were seeing. This was not a maid curtsying and giggling and scurrying back to her post. This was something else. She lifted the lid of the harpsichord, pressed the stool back gently, and sat with a grace that should not have belonged to someone in a servant's uniform. The wooden seat groaned faintly beneath her. No one spoke. Outside, birds chirped in the high trees beyond the salon's tall windows. The light had warmed slightly, casting shadows against the parquet floor. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed. Inside, time stilled. Geneviève's hands hovered just above the keys. They were small hands, the hands of someone who worked, with calluses along the fingers, faint scars from scrubbing and chopping and carrying. But as they lowered to the harpsichord, the movement was fluid, familiar, as though the instrument had always been waiting for her. She placed her fingers in position. And then, with no ceremony at all, she began to play. The first notes were so quiet they almost disappeared into the stillness. A single melodic phrase, tentative only in its softness, not its clarity, rippled through the salon like the first drop of rain on still water. Geneviève's fingers moved with unhurried precision, pressing gently into the keys, coaxing the sound out rather than forcing it. The music took shape as Mozart's Sonata in C major, a piece that required more than skill. It required understanding, balance, breath. The courtiers remained frozen. One of the ladies held a silk fan mid-motion before lowering it soundlessly to her lap. A gentleman in a blue frock coat, still holding his glass of cordial, forgot to sip. No one moved. It was not decorum that held them so still. It was disbelief. The melody unfolded with increasing confidence, the themes intertwining, rising and falling like a conversation spoken in another language. Geneviève's posture was exact, not rigid but grounded, shaped by muscle memory and years of hidden discipline. Her hands did not tremble. Her back remained straight, her chin slightly tilted, her expression unreadable, neither nervous nor proud. She did not seek approval. She simply played. Outside the salon, the breeze rustled the magnolia branches against the tall windows, and the scent of summer drifted faintly into the gilded room. Inside, the only sound was Mozart, his music, full of light and architecture, unfolding like a secret revealed by degrees. Geneviève moved through the passages with astonishing control, shading the dynamics with the lift of a wrist, the delay of a single beat. She played not as someone showing what she knew, but as someone returning home. From his place near the center of the salon, Prince Charles no longer smiled. The smirk that had curled his mouth had faded within the first measures. Now, he sat forward slightly, elbows on his knees, watching her with a concentration that darkened his gaze. His amusement had been replaced by a sharp, uncomfortable interest, like a man realizing he had tossed a spark into a dry field without meaning to start a fire. She should not have known the piece. Not without instruction. Not without years of refinement. Even noble girls who studied music full-time rarely played with such depth. Some could mimic, but few could interpret. Geneviève was doing both, and with devastating elegance. No one dared interrupt. Even the occasional cough or shifting chair that typically filled court gatherings was absent now. The performance had ceased to be a diversion. It had become a disturbance. Something in it defied classification. She was no longer a maid in a worn uniform. The air around her shimmered with command. When she reached the development section of the sonata, the left hand drove deeper into the lower register, offering tension and texture, while the right wove clear, elegant lines above it. Geneviève played with such restraint that the emotion came through all the more acutely: melancholy, gentleness, defiance, and the faintest trace of joy. By the time the piece resolved, after the final cadence melted into silence, the salon had turned into a cathedral of held breath. Geneviève lifted her hands, slowly, letting them rest on her lap. The room remained utterly still, as though no one dared shatter what had just occurred. Seconds passed. Still no one applauded. The silence did not feel respectful. It felt uncertain, unnerving. Someone at the far end of the room shifted uncomfortably. A lady lowered her gaze, as if unsure what expression was acceptable. The prince's fingers were laced together beneath his chin. His mouth was closed, but tension had settled in the corners of his jaw. Geneviève did not look at him. She stood. Her skirt rustled faintly as she stepped away from the harpsichord. Her hands, red at the knuckles from scrubbing floors only an hour ago, were now perfectly still at her sides. She returned to the space where her pail still waited, though it seemed absurd now that she might kneel again, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. From the crowd, the Dowager Duchess de Cambon rose to her feet. She was a thin woman, in a stiffly boned gown of dove-gray silk, her face painted with meticulous care, her silver hair gathered high. Her voice, when it came, was sharp and clear. "Who taught you to play like that?" The words rang like a bell struck too hard. Geneviève faced her slowly. Her head remained slightly bowed, but her voice was calm when she answered. "I was taught as a child." Murmurs began to swell behind fans. The answer was far too vague and far too bold. The Duchess narrowed her eyes, stepping forward until the hem of her gown nearly touched the edge of the harpsichord bench. A child of whom? The question was pointed, and not just in tone. Geneviève did not answer. She lowered her gaze, revealing nothing. Charles had not moved. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze locked on Geneviève as if trying to reconcile what he had seen with what he thought he knew. The rest of the room seemed to lean forward without realizing it. One of the younger courtiers, too eager, let out a small, strained laugh. "Perhaps she's possessed." That drew a few more anxious chuckles, but they fizzled almost as soon as they began. "Is she even French?" someone whispered nearby. "She must have been trained by someone," came another voice. "Not a commoner. That technique. Not even the Duchess's daughters can play like that." Geneviève stood motionless beside the harpsichord, the tips of her fingers resting lightly against its edge. She no longer looked like a girl trying to avoid notice. There was a gravity in her presence that held the entire room in suspension. The maître de musique had arrived at some point during the performance. He now hovered near the threshold, face pale, his hands folded behind his back. He'd heard the sonata from outside the salon, and he remained outside now, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to cross the threshold. From the corner of the room, a minor courtier broke the silence. Someone should fetch the king. The suggestion landed like a stone dropped into still water. No one repeated it aloud, but the implication spread instantly. This had moved beyond entertainment. This was a matter of attention, of status, of order. Charles slowly rose from his chair. The movement alone was enough to hush the room. He took a few steps forward, not toward Geneviève, but toward the harpsichord. He looked down at the keys as if they might answer a question he hadn't yet spoken. The carved wood gleamed beneath the light of the chandelier, pristine and unassuming. He touched one of the keys, just once, and the note rang out, cold and solitary. Then he straightened and turned to face the assembled courtiers. "She played it better than most of you," he said simply. The silence grew heavier. Then, with a motion of his hand, Charles gestured toward Geneviève. "Have her brought to the king." The words fell without fanfare, but the weight of them was unmistakable. Genevieve's head turned toward him, but her face remained expressionless. The Dowager Duchess looked pleased. 2 guards appeared at the entrance, summoned by a page. They moved with quiet authority, their uniforms crisp, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. One of them spoke to Geneviève in a low voice. She did not protest. She wiped her hands on her apron once, then followed them out of the salon. She did not look back. And as the doors closed behind her, the court erupted, not in cheers, but in low, urgent whispers that spread like smoke through the golden room. The prince remained where he was, facing the harpsichord. His fingers rested lightly on the lid as if it still carried the echo of her touch. Then he turned toward the door, his expression unreadable, his breath held still in his chest, because the sound of footsteps was approaching from down the corridor, marching in pairs, and they were coming for her. Geneviève walked between the guards without sound. The corridor they led her down stretched endlessly ahead, the walls lined with mirrors and tall windows that allowed slanted beams of sunlight to stripe the floor. Her shoes made no sound on the polished stone, and the weight of every gaze they passed carved a deeper chill into her spine. Maids paused with linens draped over their arms. A steward stopped in the middle of giving orders. No one spoke. Some lowered their eyes, others stared openly. Word traveled faster than sense in a palace like this. Each step forward made the air feel thinner, the weight of her presence heavier. The guards flanked her with practiced silence, not cruel but impassive, as though they'd been told to escort an object, not a person. They did not touch her, but she felt as if they had. Her palms, hidden beneath the folds of her skirt, were damp. They turned a corner into the hall of marble, a cavernous expanse where light spilled from high windows and collected on the glossy floor like pools of white gold. The scent of beeswax and old incense lingered faintly in the air. Tall marble pillars lined both sides of the hall, rising like trees in a forest designed by kings. At the far end, beneath a tapestry depicting Apollo surrounded by the muses, stood the throne chair, not used for official court, but for private royal audiences. King Louis sat there now, clad in a deep crimson coat with gold embroidery stitched like vines across the chest. His powdered wig was freshly dressed, his jowls tense, his fingers resting on the carved arms of the chair as though he meant to grip the whole room into silence. Beside him sat the Queen, Marie Antoinette, in a gown of pale blue silk that shimmered like frost. Her posture was serene, but her expression unreadable. Behind them, a handful of advisors lingered in shadow. Among them, the maître de musique, eyes narrowed. Geneviève was brought to a stop a few paces before the dais. She curtsied deeply, careful not to waver. Her eyes remained on the floor. The floor felt safer than any face in the room. The king spoke first, his voice heavy and deliberate. "You are the girl who played in the salon." She lifted her head slowly. "Yes, Your Majesty." You are a scullery maid. Yet you performed Mozart as if trained by a court musician. His tone was not accusing yet, but it was close. You will tell us how this is possible. I was taught as a child, she said again. By whom? The Queen asked, her voice softer but no less pointed. Geneviève hesitated, her breath caught before it reached her mouth. By a man who lived near our village. A beat of silence followed. The King raised one brow. His name? She hesitated again. This time the air tightened around her. She could feel it, the way the stillness bristled, the way the eyes in the room leaned forward. She looked up, not at the King, not at the Queen, but at the maître de musique. And then she said it. Armand Delatour. The name struck the hall like a blow to a drum. The Queen's fingers stilled against the embroidery of her gown. One of the advisers muttered something beneath his breath. The maître de musique went stiff, his jaw clenched, a tremor visible in the line of his shoulder. The King stared at her. That name is not to be spoken in this palace. Geneviève said nothing. Do you understand what you've said? He demanded. I do. Delatour was banished from Versailles. He was forbidden from teaching. He was... The King broke off, his mouth compressing. He was dangerous. Geneviève's voice remained even. He taught me music. Nothing else. A breath passed through the room. Not a word from the Queen. Not a whisper from the shadows. The King leaned forward. How did a scullery maid come to meet a disgraced royal musician? My father once served the family that gave Delatour refuge after he was exiled. When that family fell into ruin, my father remained to care for the property. Delatour stayed on, hidden. He offered to teach me. You were what, 5, 6? The Queen asked quietly. I was 8 when I began. And your father permitted it? He insisted on it, she answered. The King let out a low sound, somewhere between disdain and disbelief. And now your father is dead. Yes, Your Majesty. How long ago? 2 years. The Queen watched her closely now. Not with suspicion, but something more difficult to define. An edge of calculation. You speak with clarity, the Queen said at last. I was taught that as well. That much is evident. The Queen looked to her husband, then to the maître de musique. Was the sonata correctly performed? The maître de musique nodded, though reluctantly. It was beyond correct. It was interpretive, subtle. That does not sound like praise. It's not condemnation either. And you taught her nothing? I've never spoken to her before today. The Queen turned back to Geneviève. Did Delatour ever speak of returning to court? No, Geneviève said. He only spoke of music and caution. The King's eyes narrowed. What did he caution you against? People who mistake talent for treason. The words were out before she could swallow them. A flicker of too much honesty and too little fear. There was a long pause. The Queen's face remained unchanged. The King, however, leaned back slowly. You presume a great deal. Geneviève did not answer. At that moment, the doors behind her opened again. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. The prince had arrived. Charles-Edouard did not bow. He moved past the guards and stopped beside Geneviève without looking at her. His expression was composed, but tension radiated from the set of his shoulders. You summoned me, he said to the King. I did not, Louis replied. But you are here all the same. I wish to see the outcome of my remark. Your foolishness has forced us into a predicament. The King stood. His full height was imposing, even softened by age. You made a public declaration. In jest or not, it cannot be left unanswered. I did not think she would play, Charles said evenly. Clearly, the King snapped. The Queen interjected, her tone lighter. You offered marriage, Charles. I offered nonsense. It was mockery, nothing more. She played Mozart, the Queen said. Better than most, I've heard. The King frowned. A maid cannot marry a prince. That should not require explanation. Charles said nothing. The silence returned, thick and close. Then the king's tone hardened. The girl must be watched. She is not to leave the grounds. The queen offered no protest. Her attention remained fixed on Geneviève. The king looked to the guards. Take her to the steward's office. Let them place her under supervision. As the guard stepped forward, Geneviève inclined her head again. She turned without resistance. Her spine remained straight, her gaze calm. But just before she was led out, she looked once toward the prince. He looked away. They walked her back through the hall of marble, her footsteps slower this time. The hush that followed her was no longer curiosity. It was the heavy kind of silence that follows an accusation. They passed a line of footmen, a housekeeper who bowed without looking at her, a valet who stared too long. And at the far end of the corridor, a second set of boots sounded, heavier, sharper, growing louder with each step. A new set of guards had been dispatched, their destination clear. The door to the steward's office closed behind her with a quiet but decisive sound. The chamber was modest compared to the gilded grandeur of the rest of the palace, its furnishings heavy, functional, and dimly lit by a single window draped in thick woolen curtains. The scent of ink and drying paper hung in the air. Geneviève stood motionless in the center of the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, her expression unreadable. The steward, a thin man with narrow shoulders and a quill perpetually ink-stained at the fingertips, sat behind a broad oak desk. He barely looked at her. Instead, he reached for a ledger, leafed through it, and made a mark beside her name. When he finally lifted his gaze, it was indifferent. "You are to remain within the servants' quarters unless called for," he said. "You'll take no letters, send no messages, and answer no inquiries unless they come directly from the royal family or the maître de musique. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Very well." He stood and gestured to a young page by the door. "Have her taken to the lower wing. Assign her a space in the third room." Geneviève followed without speaking. The boy who guided her down the corridor looked scarcely older than 13 and kept casting glances at her out of the corner of his eye, as if half expecting her to levitate off the floor or grow wings. She kept her focus forward, feeling the faint pulse of every stare, every whisper that followed her path. The story of what had happened in the salon was already moving through the halls like smoke under a door. They descended narrow servant staircases that wound like arteries through the walls of the palace. These halls had no chandeliers, only rush torches burning in sconces, and the walls were thick with the scent of tallow and mildew. They passed no one for several minutes. It was cooler here. Stone floors, no windows, the occasional gust of air from a high, grated opening. The underground parts of the palace weren't meant for dignity. They were meant for function and silence. The page stopped outside a plain wooden door with a tarnished iron handle. He opened it and gestured for her to step inside. The room was small, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wooden trunk, and a chamber pot. A basin sat on a cracked stone stand in the corner. A single candle stub flickered in a wall sconce. The air smelled of wax, dust, and dried soap. He left without a word. Geneviève set her hands on the edge of the washstand, staring at her reflection in the water's surface. Her own face looked distant to her, drawn, pale, with high color in her cheeks that hadn't faded since leaving the hall of marble. She reached up to loosen the ribbon that bound her hair at the nape of her neck, letting the dark strands fall forward like a curtain. She stayed that way for several minutes. Then, moving with care, she knelt beside the trunk. Beneath her folded shift and a wrapped bar of lye soap, she found it, a slim packet wrapped in linen. She unfolded it and withdrew the letter. The paper was already creased from handling. She had read it too many times to need to look at the words again, but she unfolded it nonetheless, her eyes tracing the loops and sharp angles of the handwriting. "Geneviève, there are two kinds of silence, one you choose and one that is forced upon you. I hope you will remember which kind this is." The past must remain still. Even beauty can be dangerous when it appears in the wrong place, at the wrong time. They will not look at you and see a girl. They will look at you and see a story that must be buried. Play nothing unless you must. And if you must, do not play without purpose. Be careful whom you answer. Be careful what you reveal. Be more careful still with what you feel. A.D. She pressed the letter flat against the floorboard for a moment. Then, in one swift motion, she reached for the stub of the candle in the wall. With the end of the paper held carefully between her fingers, she lowered a corner of the letter into the flame. The fire caught instantly, curling the edge into black lace. She watched it burn, the heat too close to her fingers, the smoke curling into the low ceiling like a question never asked. When the last curl of ash drifted downward, she stood and opened the narrow window above the basin to let the smoke escape. The corridor outside her room remained quiet. Hours passed. When she was summoned again, it was by another page, older this time, and breathless, as though sent running. He did not speak to her directly, only handed her a folded note sealed with the Queen's emblem and gestured for her to follow. He led her back through the servants' halls, up the narrow back staircase that opened behind the east wing, and into a smaller chamber paneled in cream and pale blue silk. The Queen stood alone at the window, her back to the door. Geneviève entered, closed the door behind her, and curtsied without being asked. "You may rise," the Queen said, still not turning around. Geneviève obeyed, folding her hands in front of her, waiting. "I asked that you be brought here because I did not wish to ask questions in a room full of men," the Queen said. "They listen poorly when they're trying to look intelligent." Geneviève said nothing. "Tell me," the Queen continued, "what do you believe a woman's greatest weapon is?" It wasn't a rhetorical question, but it didn't invite a challenge either. After a moment, Geneviève replied, "Memory." The Queen turned slowly, and her face broke into a small, cold smile. "You were taught by Delatour," she said. "Yes. And what else did he teach you?" "To know when not to answer." For the first time, a note of amusement flickered in the Queen's gaze. "Very good." She stepped closer, the silk of her gown rustling faintly over the floor. "Did he teach you politics?" "No, Your Majesty. But you understand them." "I've lived among their consequences." The Queen studied her for a long moment, as if trying to place her within a puzzle whose edges were still uncertain. "The king is unconvinced," she said. "He sees Delatour's name and hears revolution. He sees talent in a girl who should not possess it and hears conspiracy. I do not think you're dangerous. Not yet. But you make the court uncomfortable, and that alone is a threat. I did not intend to cause trouble." "No one ever does," the Queen said. "Still, here we are." She moved back toward the window and paused there, one hand resting on the sill. "I've arranged a performance," she said. 2 days from now, a private recital for the diplomatic envoy from Bavaria. They've requested music. You will play." Genevieve's breath caught. "I do not ask lightly," the Queen added. "The piece will be chosen by the maître de musique. You will play it in the Rose Hall, and you will do so under full supervision." Geneviève inclined her head. "As Your Majesty wishes." The Queen nodded once, then turned fully back toward her. "You may go." Geneviève curtsied again, her thoughts already spinning. As she stepped back into the corridor, she did not see the figure waiting at the far end of the hallway, hidden just beyond the arch of a colonnade. Prince Charles stood in shadow, arms crossed, having heard only the echo of her final words. He remained still, his mouth set in a line, his gaze following her, until she turned the next corner. But as he turned to go, his foot struck something near the threshold of the side passage. A narrow, lacquered ring box, left slightly ajar, as if dropped in haste. Inside it sat a gold ring, delicate in size, engraved with a crest he knew far too well. Charles stood unmoving, the lacquered box balanced in his open palm, the gold ring catching the dim light from the corridor's high window. It was not a common ring. Its design was too intricate, too deliberate. The crest engraved on the inner band was unmistakable to anyone born into nobility. A rearing stag beneath a crown of oak leaves, flanked by 2 falcons. He knew the symbol. Everyone in court did, though few dared speak of it now. It belonged to the de Montclair family, but the de Montclair had ceased to exist nearly a decade ago. Charles closed the box with a quiet snap, the sound sharp in the stillness. The skin along the back of his neck prickled. The de Montclairs had fallen in disgrace, publicly, irrevocably. Whispers of treason, then silence. Their lands had been seized, their name erased from records, their portraits removed from galleries. The family had disappeared, and no one in court had dared ask what had become of the child. He slid the box into the inside pocket of his coat and walked away from the corridor, each step deliberate, though his pulse had begun to beat with an unfamiliar urgency. The rest of the day passed in a haze. His thoughts chased themselves in circles, always returning to the same impossibility. A cleaning girl, a discarded name, a forbidden sonata. He tried to force the logic apart from the emotion, but it tangled too tightly. Geneviève was no longer an oddity. She was something far more dangerous. As twilight settled across the palace, painting the windows in lavender and rust, Charles stood alone in the small study adjacent to the royal archives. The room smelled of dust and old vellum. A single oil lamp burned beside him, casting its flickering glow over stacks of bound volumes. The ledgers were heavy, their leather spines cracked from decades of use. He opened them one by one, moving methodically through estate records, noble registries, titles struck and reassigned. It took time, but he found it. Montclair, Vicomte de Belleval. The entry was brief. Property seized, 1777. Allegiance questioned. Subjects removed. Lineage terminated. The ink had faded in places, but he saw it clearly. One child, no name listed. Female. Age, 6. The mother's line, unnamed. The father, Etienne de Montclair. Charles leaned back, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. The silence in the room pressed close, oppressive. He looked again at the words. No name, no record of where she had gone, no notation of death. Just a missing girl, born into scandal, and then erased. He felt the weight of the ring inside his coat pocket. It was not proof, but it was enough. The facts were beginning to align too neatly to be coincidence. A girl with refined posture, perfectly fluent in music, hiding behind a maid's uniform. A girl taught in secret by Armand Delatour, the one man who had refused to retract his support for the Montclair family even after his dismissal from court. A girl who had said almost nothing about herself, but had let music speak in her place. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the stone floor. He knew now that she would not be safe. Not as long as the court suspected the truth. She had exposed just enough to invite danger. She had been watched from the moment she touched the harpsichord. The queen might admire her poise, but admiration was fragile. The king would not suffer a Montclair beneath his roof, let alone in his presence. And yet Charles could not tell anyone what he now suspected. To do so would be to sign her exile, or worse. He left the study at once, moving through the corridors with long, clipped strides. The light in the halls had dimmed, and most of the household was either at supper or preparing for bed. He took the back staircase again, past the linen closets and servant stores, until he reached the corridor where the lower quarters were kept. He found her door easily. It was the only one without sound beyond it. The others had laughter, the clatter of bowls, the soft murmur of girls chatting behind closed wood. Geneviève's door was silent. He knocked once. A pause. Then he heard the soft scrape of a stool, the creak of a hinge. The door opened. She stood there in the candlelight, wearing the same plain shift and apron, though her hair was unbound and fell in loose waves over her shoulders. The light caught on the strands, turning them the color of old bronze. Her eyes, when they met his, were steady. Cautious, not surprised. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. He stepped inside without invitation. She didn't stop him. The room was unchanged, bare, cold, and clean. The air held a trace of smoke from the candle stub, a curl of wax dripping down its side. The basin had been emptied. The trunk was shut. She closed the door behind him. Charles turned to face her, searching her expression. "You wore a ring earlier today," he said. "You're not wearing it now." She said nothing. He reached into his coat and withdrew the lacquered box. Her eyes locked on it. He opened it without a word. Her shoulders tensed, not visibly, but he saw it. It was found in the corridor outside the Queen's study. Still, she did not speak. It bears the Montclair crest. A flicker, the first true change in her expression. Surprise, but also something else. Pain. He had not seen it on her face before, not even in the salon. "That name is gone," she said. "It was never yours?" he asked. She looked away. "It was never safe to claim. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you." He stepped closer. The space between them shrank to nothing. "You need to leave this palace," he said. "Tonight, if you can." She met his gaze. "And go where?" "Anywhere. Anywhere but here. They'll think I've run. They'll call it guilt. They already suspect too much," he said. "The recital the Queen has arranged. It's not for music. It's a test. She wants to see what you'll reveal. What the court will see. If they find out who you are." Her voice was steady. "They won't believe it. They will." A pause. Geneviève stepped past him, her hand brushing lightly along the edge of the washstand. She opened the trunk with a soft creak and withdrew a small linen bundle. She held it tightly, not unwrapping it. "I haven't lied," she said. "Not once." "I know. I haven't asked for anything. I know that too." She turned back toward him, and something in her face had changed. Not vulnerability, but the willingness to let him see that she was tired. "You should go," she said. "If anyone finds you here, I'll say I got lost," he said. "They'll believe it. You're not a fool, Charles." He smiled faintly. "Not entirely." She exhaled, then set the bundle back into the trunk. Her movements were methodical, not hurried. "Why did you come?" she asked finally. He hesitated. "I had to see for myself," he said, "whether the girl who played Mozart was real." Geneviève watched him for a long time. Then, without another word, she moved to the window and opened the shutters. The night was dark beyond, stars obscured by low clouds. Wind rustled the ivy along the stone. They stood in silence, the kind that deepens rather than diminishes. The kind that asks a question no one dares speak aloud. Then came the sound of boots in the corridor. Heavy, measured, approaching. Geneviève didn't move from the window, but Charles did. He turned, stepped toward the far wall, and reached for the edge of a small wooden panel in the plaster, a disused servant passage, narrow and dark. He slipped through it just as the handle of her door began to turn. And as it opened, Geneviève reached under her mattress and pulled out a sealed letter. The door opened with a quiet creak, and Geneviève had just enough time to press the letter flat against the underside of her mattress before the flicker of lamplight slid across the floor. She straightened as a shadow filled the doorway. The figure who stepped inside was not a guard, but one of the Queen's ladies, a lean, middle-aged woman with sharp cheekbones and a dark gaze that missed little. She carried a folded shawl over one arm and an envelope in the other. Her steps were soundless on the stone as she entered, her expression tight with something that was neither disdain nor friendliness. It was the look of someone performing a duty they hadn't chosen. "You're to dress properly for the rehearsal," she said without preamble. "Her Majesty has sent something suitable." Geneviève didn't move. The woman looked around the room with a faint pinch to her mouth. "You'll change here. There's no time for vanity." She dropped the bundle of fabric onto the foot of the bed. The dress, when unwrapped, revealed itself to be a simple but finely made gown of dark gray muslin with modest lace at the cuffs and neckline. Not ornate, not decorative. Something between mourning and performance. "Be outside in 10 minutes, the woman said, before sweeping back through the door, leaving a trail of faint lavender scent behind her. The latch clicked shut. Geneviève exhaled slowly and turned to the gown. Her hands moved automatically, stripping off the worn apron, the faded skirts, the coarse shift. She worked quickly, folding each item and placing them beside the wash basin. As she slipped the new gown over her shoulders, her fingers paused for a moment against the inner seams. There were no embellishments, no embroidery, but the weight of it made her feel suddenly taller, sharper. The fabric whispered down her legs as she smoothed it into place. She tied the laces at the back with practiced efficiency and brushed the tangles from her hair with a wooden comb. There was no mirror, only the basin's water. She used her palm to darken the curls at her temple and pinch her cheeks for color. When she stepped into the corridor, 2 guards were already waiting. They said nothing, merely nodded and turned in unison to lead her away. The palace was quieter now, wrapped in the hush of late evening. The passage they followed wound through lesser-used halls lit by oil sconces and narrow windows that showed nothing but night. There were no courtiers here, no whispers behind fans, no judgmental glances. Only echoing footfalls and the occasional creak of timber. They reached the music salon, and one of the guards pushed open the tall double doors. The space had transformed. The furniture had been rearranged to face the harpsichord. Tall candelabras flickered from each corner, casting golden light over the marble floor. In the far corner stood the maître de musique, flanked by a servant holding a sheaf of music. He glanced at Geneviève when she entered, his expression unreadable, then nodded once in acknowledgement. "Come," he said simply. She walked toward him, conscious of the faint swish of her skirts and the way the candlelight seemed to cling to her silhouette. The guards remained at the door. He gestured toward the bench. "You'll play this," he said, handing her the top page. "Mozart's Sonata No. 8, D major." She took the paper with steady hands. Her gaze swept across the notes, each phrase familiar, yet full of intricacy. It was a work of balance, ornamentation, and clarity. There would be no room for hesitation. The maître de musique stepped back. "Begin when you are ready." Geneviève seated herself. The harpsichord was freshly tuned, the wood still warm beneath her hands. She placed the sheet in front of her, though she knew the music by heart. She began to play. The first movement rose with brightness and restraint, its cheerful phrasing cloaking a deceptive complexity. She leaned into it with care, shaping the dynamics with precision, letting each line unfold as if telling a secret. The notes shimmered in the high ceiling, as if drawn there by some unseen thread. She felt the presence of the others in the room without looking. A page had slipped in and stood near the far wall. The woman from before had returned, her arms folded. Someone else stepped in quietly. Another official, perhaps. But Geneviève kept her focus fixed. The music demanded everything. By the end of the first movement, the room had shifted. Still. Listening. She moved seamlessly into the second, her fingers dancing over the upper registers. The music became less ornamental, more intimate. She let the melody slow just slightly, giving it breath, space. She played not for them, but for herself, for the shadow of Delatour in every phrase, for the echo of her father's voice correcting her posture, for the ache she carried like a second spine. When she reached the final movement, her hands flew with purpose, not haste. There was joy in it, cleverness masked by discipline. The piece ended with a flourish that seemed almost to bow on her behalf. She lifted her hands from the keys. Silence. Then the maître de musique nodded once, eyes narrowed. "Good." You will play that piece at the recital. Geneviève nodded. The servant collected the pages. Another voice spoke from the doorway. She'll need a second piece, said the woman with the shawl. Something for contrast. The maître de musique glanced at her, and something passed between them. He turned back to Geneviève. You will also perform a composition of your choosing. Geneviève blinked once. May I choose from within the approved? No, he said. You will choose something that reflects your interpretation. Her Majesty insists. The candlelight shifted across her face. She looked down at the harpsichord, fingers curling slightly. I understand, she said softly. The rehearsal ended without applause, without remark. She was dismissed and led back through the corridors in silence, the woman trailing behind her like a second shadow. When they reached her chamber, the guards turned and walked away without speaking. The woman stepped inside behind her and closed the door. Geneviève turned slowly. The woman stepped closer, holding out a folded parchment. You'll find instructions inside, she said. On the day of the recital, you'll be dressed in the same gown. Your hair will be arranged. You'll be escorted to the Rose Hall by mid-afternoon. No one else is to speak with you before the performance. Not even the prince. Geneviève stiffened. The woman tilted her head. Yes, we know. Geneviève said nothing. The woman didn't smile. She placed the parchment on the washstand, adjusted the candle, and left without another word. The door clicked shut. Geneviève stood still for a long time. Then she stepped to the trunk, lifted the lid, and retrieved a second linen wrap. Inside was a small bound notebook, its cover worn, its edges darkened by time. She opened it to the last page and began to copy out the opening lines of a piece she hadn't played since she was a child. She didn't know yet if she would play it. She only knew she had to remember it. The hours passed unnoticed. The candle burned low, sputtered, then died. And in the deep silence of the corridor outside her door, another set of footsteps halted in front of her chamber and did not move. The footsteps remained outside her door, neither approaching nor retreating, suspended in that charged silence that comes when someone decides between entering or vanishing. Geneviève stood barefoot beside the washstand, the thin notebook still open in her hands, the music half written on the page. Her breath slowed until it matched the rhythm of the ticking silence. A full minute passed. Then, without knocking, the steps turned and faded away, as though whoever had lingered had thought better of it. She closed the notebook gently. Morning broke soon after, soft and colourless, behind a veil of fog that rolled in from the river beyond the palace grounds. Through the small slit window above her basin, she could see almost nothing, only a thin line of light and the ghostly shadow of the outer wall. There were no bells, no fanfares. But she didn't need them to know what day it was, the day of the recital. She dressed quietly. The gown from the night before had been brushed and returned by a handmaid before sunrise, left neatly folded on her cot. A small parcel of dried bread and an apple lay beside it, untouched. She ate only a bite, the food turning dry and heavy in her mouth. Her stomach resisted everything except water. By mid-morning the door opened again, this time without ceremony, and the same lady-in-waiting appeared. 2 attendants followed, carrying combs, pins, and a small wooden case lined with velvet. The air smelled faintly of rose oil and starch. No one spoke as Geneviève was seated on the edge of the bed, and her hair was brushed through with long, even strokes. They worked quickly, twisting her dark hair into a low chignon and pinning it into place with quiet efficiency. No ornamentation, no powder, just simplicity, just control. When the lady nodded her approval, the other women stepped back, gathered their things, and disappeared into the corridor again. Geneviève was left standing in silence. The candle on her wall had burned low, its flame barely steady. She pressed her hand briefly to the center of her chest, where her heart felt too close to the surface, then reached for the notebook and tucked it deep into the folds of her gown. She wouldn't bring it into the Rose Hall. but she needed it near. A light knock on the door followed. This time, the guard who waited for her was familiar. He didn't speak, only gestured. She followed. They moved through the palace slowly, the route different from any she'd taken before. The walls here were lighter, adorned with frescoes and trimmed in carved plaster shaped like garlands of fruit and vines. Servants moved aside when they passed, eyes lowered. At each corner, another pair of guards stood posted. The air was laced with fresh wax and the faint scent of flowers brought in from the gardens, though the blooms were few this late in the season. Finally, they reached a narrow corridor of polished parquet, its walls lined with portraits. The Rose Hall stood at the far end. She had only seen it once before, when dusting sconces months ago. Then, it had seemed like a room torn from a painting, too grand to belong to any reality. Now, as the doors were opened, the effect was the same. The hall was long and narrow, with arched windows along one side and delicate plaster roses climbing the opposite wall in soft relief. The floor was a pale herringbone, and the walls had been draped in silk panels of dusky rose and ivory. At the far end sat a harpsichord, smaller than the salon instrument, but elegant, its lacquered case painted with garden scenes. Rows of chairs had been arranged before it in neat semicircles, and already murmurs filled the space. Courtiers entered in pairs, voices hushed. Among them were men and women she recognized only from a distance, ambassadors, minor royalty, a handful of known diplomats. The Bavarian envoy was seated near the front, his powdered wig impossibly tall, his companion's gloved hand resting delicately on his sleeve. The queen had not yet arrived, nor had the king. Geneviève was led to the far end of the hall where a small antechamber had been prepared. Inside, a single chair waited beside a table laid with parchment, a cup of water, and a folded handkerchief. A mirror hung on the opposite wall. She sat. The door was left ajar, and she could hear the hum of conversation swell and break in waves. A quarter hour passed, then a hush, the unmistakable rustle of silk, footsteps in rhythmic succession. The queen entered the Rose Hall with quiet authority, her presence part of the ceremony. She wore silver-grey satin, embroidered with pearls at the hem and cuffs. Her expression was calm, neutral, not smiling. She greeted no one directly, only nodded once before taking her seat. Moments later, the king appeared. Slower, less elegant. He offered the ambassador a few words of welcome, which were received with careful bows. Geneviève remained seated, waiting. Her palms were warm despite the coolness of the chamber. She curled them into fists in her lap, then opened them again. A soft rap at the door. She stood. The maître de musique entered, offering her a brief, scrutinizing glance. "You will play the Mozart sonata first. No announcement will be made. When you begin, the court will know." She nodded. His tone softened, almost imperceptibly. "You remember your second selection?" "Yes." "Good." He stepped back and gestured. Geneviève walked with her hands clasped before her, each step slow and measured. As she crossed the threshold into the Rose Hall, the crowd turned to face her. The air shifted, charged with expectation. She did not curtsy. She did not smile. She walked straight to the harpsichord, seated herself, and adjusted the stool. Her back was straight, her shoulders low. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She began. The sonata unfolded with quiet brilliance, clean, elegant, unforced. Each note fell precisely, ringing clear through the high-arched room. The court watched in silence, though some exchanged glances behind fans and gloves. The king leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing. The queen sat motionless, her hands clasped gently in her lap. Geneviève played without faltering, moving from one phrase to the next, as if stepping across a line of stones above water. She had played this piece more times than she could count, but never like this. Never under the weight of so many eyes. As the final measures approached, she allowed the music to slow, not sluggishly, but with intention, each cadence drawing the attention of the room more tightly around her. The last chord settled like dust. Silence followed. And then, light, tentative applause, polite, measured, respectful. She stood. A courtier near the back murmured something unintelligible, but no laughter followed. The maître de musique stepped forward, handing her a second sheet of music. Blank. A signal. She sat once more. This time she did not look up. Her hands moved to the keys. The opening chords were slower, weightier. Not Mozart, not courtly. A different melody entirely. Minor, delicate, and unfamiliar to most ears, but rich, intimate. A piece not meant for salons, but for memory. She did not glance at the king or queen. She did not glance at the prince, who, though she could not see him, she knew was somewhere in the shadows at the back. She played as if the room were empty. The melody deepened. Harmonies unfolded. A crescendo, then restraint. The texture of it was unlike anything the court had heard that season, perhaps that year. It ached without being mournful. It hoped without declaring joy. People leaned forward. The king stiffened. The queen's fan stilled. When the final phrase ended, no one clapped. Not because they didn't know whether they should, but because they didn't yet know what they'd heard. Geneviève stood again. And as she stepped away from the harpsichord, a breathless page entered through the eastern arch, eyes wide, and whispered something into the maître de musique's ear. His face went pale, and in the same moment, a cry was heard from the gardens behind the hall. The cry from the gardens was sharp, distinctly male, and cut through the stillness of the Rose Hall with violent precision. The sound didn't belong to any court ritual. It wasn't performance or theater. It was raw, unvarnished alarm. Heads turned in unison. Chairs scraped faintly across the polished floor as courtiers shifted, uncertain whether to rise or remain seated. For a breathless moment, no one moved, held in a collective tension between curiosity and fear. Geneviève froze near the harpsichord, her fingers curled loosely at her sides. The echo of the final note still seemed to shimmer in the room, clashing with the sudden reality of that cry. The maître de musique stepped toward the page who had rushed in. His voice was low, sharp. What happened? The page answered in a whisper, but his urgency betrayed the gravity of it. His words were not meant for the entire room, but fragments traveled, enough for a wave of awareness to ripple across the assembly. Someone had been found. In the gardens, unconscious. Or, no, worse. Geneviève turned to look at the maître de musique. His complexion had gone chalky, his mouth drawn into a thin line. He whispered again to the page, who darted from the room like a thread pulled from silk. The queen stood. That alone was enough to draw everyone to their feet. The king followed, less graceful, his brow drawn into a thunderous line. "We will adjourn," he said curtly. "All of you, return to your chambers. Do not move about the palace until further instruction." His command struck the room with force. The Bavarian envoy rose slowly, offering a brief, formal bow. His companion gathered her skirts. Other courtiers followed suit, falling into murmured lines, exiting through the western doors in a current of silks, lace, and alarmed glances. No one laughed now. No one dared. Geneviève remained still until the queen passed by her. There was no word of acknowledgement, no glance. Only the faintest narrowing of the queen's eyes as she swept past, as if the distance between them had grown longer, and the terrain between them had changed. The king and his advisers left swiftly. The maître de musique remained behind a moment longer, gathering the music sheets with mechanical precision. He looked up once, at Geneviève, and something passed over his face. Not suspicion, something quieter, like pity. "Go to your room," he said. "Stay there." She nodded. He didn't wait for her to leave. She made her way through the narrow corridor behind the Rose Hall, the sound of her footsteps soft and steady despite the hammering in her chest. Outside the windows, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the topiary shapes of the palace gardens beyond. The pathways shimmered with the moisture of early morning, and guards moved quickly along them now, dispersing, converging, voices low and urgent. When she reached the back staircase, a page tried to stop her. "You're not permitted." "I was dismissed," she said calmly. He hesitated, then stepped aside. The servants' wing felt colder than before, too quiet. The corridors that had once echoed with routine now felt abandoned. Distant voices murmured beyond closed doors. Curtains had been drawn over some of the hallway windows, dimming the light. Her chamber door remained closed. Inside, everything was just as she had left it. She exhaled slowly, her palms pressed flat against the wood for a moment before she turned the latch and entered. The air in the room was undisturbed. The candle had long since melted into its base. The wash basin still held water, gone tepid. The linen wrap still lay folded beside her cot. She sat on the edge of the mattress. It took several minutes for her heart to slow, her hands to still. Only then did she reach beneath the mattress and retrieve the sealed letter. It was thin, the parchment delicate, the wax unbroken. She hadn't dared open it the night before. She hadn't known if she would. But now, in the aftermath of a performance that had cracked the surface of the palace and the scream that had shattered the silence afterward, she knew she couldn't ignore it. She broke the seal carefully. The letter inside was written in a hand she recognized instantly. Clean strokes, elegant but direct. Her eyes skimmed the words as she unfolded them. "Geneviève, there is more to your inheritance than a name. You must not think the world will forgive it if you step into the light. There are those at court who remember the truth, and those who will kill to keep it buried. If you are reading this, it means the day has come. You must choose carefully now who to trust. The one who summoned your father to the palace the night he died has never been named. But he is still here, and he knows who you are." She read the final lines twice, then folded the letter again with fingers that shook slightly. She didn't know what the cry had meant, but she knew now it wasn't distant. It wasn't separate from her. Someone had tried to send a message. Someone else had silenced it. A knock came at the door. Not a knock. A fist. Once. Twice. Then a voice, low, hurried, nearly frantic. "Geneviève!" She opened the door to find Charles on the threshold, breathless, his coat still open, his cravat loose. His eyes, so often guarded, were raw with urgency. "We have to go," he said. "Now." She didn't ask why. She stepped back, heart beginning to thunder again. He closed the door behind him, locking it. "There's no time," he said. "Someone is dead." Her throat tightened. He shook his head once. "Don't ask yet." He crossed the room and moved to the window, pulling the shutter inward to check the alley of garden wall that edged the back of the servants' wing. A narrow trail led from the hedge to the rear of the chapel, unseen by the main corridor windows. "I can get us through the west gate," he said. "The guards have been repositioned." Geneviève didn't move. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw the grief beneath the urgency. "Who?" she whispered. His jaw flexed. "They found the counselor from the king's inner circle," he said, "in the garden, by the stables." He didn't finish, but she saw the answer in his eyes, and she knew why his coat sleeve was stained with something dark at the cuff. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had drawn in during the time Geneviève had been gone. The air was still damp with the last traces of candle smoke, but a new scent threaded through it, earth and sweat, and something metallic. She could smell it on Charles's coat. It clung to the fabric, not vivid, not fresh, but unmistakable. She stepped closer, reaching for the cuff. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, but didn't stop her. Her fingers found the edge of the stain. It had dried in a stiff, uneven line, dark, ruddy brown against the ivory linen. Blood, not his. His eyes didn't leave hers. "He tried to corner you yesterday, didn't he?" She nodded once. "He came to my room before the rehearsal." He said I was putting the Queen in a dangerous position, that if I didn't leave quietly, he'd make sure I disappeared. Charles's mouth tightened. Did he hurt you? No, she said, though the memory of his fingers on her wrist still pulsed beneath her skin. He didn't have time. Charles exhaled sharply and turned away, bracing a hand on the edge of the washstand. His breath came in shallow draws, as if the weight of everything had just begun to settle across his shoulders. I didn't plan it, he said after a moment. I wasn't meant to see him, but I went to find you this morning before the recital. I thought I might warn you about the letter, the ring, all of it. And I saw him near the stables, speaking with one of the king's aides. He had something in his hand. I don't know what it was, but he looked triumphant. He paused, his back still to her. I followed him. I waited. Genevieve's voice was soft. And when he saw you? Charles turned. He threatened you again. Spoke your name like it was a sin. His voice broke a little, not from weakness, but from control. She saw then what it had cost him to protect her. The man who had once smirked in a gilded salon, tossing out a cruel jest as if it were nothing, now stood in front of her, like someone who had torn free of every rule that once bound him. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his face drawn, but his eyes had never been clearer. We struggled, he said quietly. He tried to grab me. There was a marble bench near the garden wall. He fell. I didn't mean... She stepped forward and pressed a hand to his chest gently. You don't have to explain. He covered her hand with his own. The silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed between them, alive with unspoken things. They both knew what would come next. There would be questions. A search. A scapegoat. If she stayed, they would blame her. If he stayed, they would use him against her. She walked to the trunk at the foot of the cot and opened it. Inside were only the barest belongings. A comb, a second pair of shoes. The linen bundle holding the last of her mother's jewelry, small, worn, long out of fashion. She folded it carefully, pressed it to her chest once, then placed it inside a cloth bag. Charles crossed the room to the door. He listened a moment, then turned the latch slowly and cracked it open. No one stood in the corridor. They're searching the west wing, he said. The king will keep the court in place as long as he can. That gives us a few hours, no more. She slipped on her cloak, the same one she had worn during winter chores, and pulled the hood low over her brow. He extended his hand. She took it. They moved through the narrow passage behind the servants' rooms, a route known only to the staff and children who had grown up playing in the underbelly of the palace. The walls were close and warm, and the floor sloped gently downward, leading them away from the central chambers and toward the storage cellars behind the kitchen wing. At one point, Charles paused and pulled open a panel behind a stack of crates. A dark stairwell yawned behind it, steep and damp. "Through here," he said. Genevieve followed without hesitation. The stair ended in a wooden passage so low Charles had to duck to move through it. It smelled of earth and lime. A cool draft whistled through cracks in the stone, carrying with it the scent of ivy and wet leaves. They reached a narrow wooden door set into the outer wall. Charles pulled a key from his pocket, an old iron thing, rusted but still functional. He turned it once, and the door creaked open to a small courtyard behind the palace stables. A single cart waited beneath the trees. It was plain, covered with a canvas tarp, drawn by a single mule. Beside it stood a stable boy, no older than 14, dressed in patched breeches and a wool cap. The boy tipped his head in greeting and handed Charles a folded cloak. "You remember the roads?" Charles asked him. The boy nodded. "As you said, through Cernay, then to the stone bridge. No diversions, no stopping." "Of course not." Charles turned to Genevieve and helped her into the cart, tucking the canvas gently around her shoulders. He climbed in beside her. The cart jolted into motion. They left the courtyard at a slow pace, winding through the outer edge of the gardens and onto the cobbled path that curved behind the southern orchard. From a distance, they were no different than produce carriers. Their mule plodded steadily, each step a fragile promise of escape. No one stopped them at the gate. The guards, preoccupied with orders from the inner court, barely glanced their way. Charles kept his hood up and his head low, his posture slouched like a merchant's assistant riding to town. The stable boy offered a casual wave as they passed, and the gate creaked open without question. The cart rolled forward. Geneviève didn't look back. They passed through the last of the outer gardens and into the open fields beyond. The fog was breaking now, revealing a blue-gray sky laced with pale clouds. The wind smelled of distant rivers and crushed herbs. Geneviève rested her hand against Charles's knee, steadying herself as the road turned. He looked down at her, the lines of his face softer in the morning light. "We'll have to disappear," he said quietly. "I already have," she replied. He gave a faint, surprised laugh, just a breath. The road stretched ahead, winding through the hills like a ribbon drawn through a tapestry. The sun broke through in a slow hush of gold, catching on the tips of tall grass and the wet curve of the hills. They traveled in silence for a long time, wrapped in the rhythm of the wheels and the sound of the mule's steady gait. Charles shifted slightly, reaching into the pocket of his coat. He pulled something small and smooth into his palm. He held it out to her. It was the ring. The Montclair crest gleamed in the sunlight. Rearing stag, crown of oak, falcons poised. Geneviève stared at it for a long moment. Then she took it, and without a word, slipped it onto her finger. Neither of them spoke again. Far behind them, the palace was beginning to stir. And ahead of them, in the hills beyond the river, lay a life still unwritten. The road narrowed as it climbed into the hills, bordered on one side by wild hedgerows and on the other by fields of wheat swaying in the breeze. The late summer sun stretched long shadows across the rutted path, painting golden light across the canvas tarp that sheltered them. Charles had shed his fine coat hours earlier, his sleeves rolled past his elbows, and his hair tousled by wind. Beside him, Geneviève sat with her legs curled beneath her chin tucked inside the folds of her borrowed cloak. The silence between them was not born of tension, but of quiet endurance. Neither of them had slept. The boy who drove the cart had fallen into a slow rhythm, guiding the mule by sound more than sight, following the winding turns of a road that led them further from everything they had known. They stopped only once, at a bend in the road near a glade filled with cypress trees, to water the mule and stretch their limbs. There, Geneviève walked barefoot through a patch of soft moss, trailing her fingers along the bark of a low tree, and felt the pressure in her chest begin to ease. Her shoes dangled from one hand. When she turned back, Charles was leaning against the cart, watching her, not guarded, not wary, just watching, as if she were something precious he didn't dare disturb. It had taken them until evening to reach the first crest of the southern hills. The air turned cooler, tinged with pine and the faint scent of wood smoke, drifting from cottages scattered in the valley below. They avoided the main roads. No one asked questions. They traveled as merchants, or travelers returning to family, or perhaps just lovers on their way to anywhere but where they'd come from. In a small village tucked along the curve of a river bank, they found shelter. The cottage was made of stone, its shutters faded to a soft green, with a narrow garden fenced by weathered wood. It had been empty for more than a season, offered quietly by the town's old priest, who remembered Charles' name, not his title, but the name he had used as a boy when traveling with a tutor through the provinces. He asked no questions. He offered a key. They settled in before the moon had risen. There was no furniture beyond a table and 2 chairs, a hearth with a pile of dry wood, and a worn mattress rolled into the corner. It was enough. That night, Geneviève lit a fire with hands that no longer trembled. She moved through the cottage slowly, feeling the shape of it, touching the cool stone walls and the warm grain of the windowsill. When she passed the mirror in the corner, she caught a glimpse of herself. Paler, thinner than she had been months ago, but no longer a shadow of a girl hidden in a palace. She looked like someone real, someone unafraid. Charles came to stand behind her and rested his hands lightly on her shoulders. Their eyes met in the glass. There were no promises spoken aloud. There didn't need to be. Weeks passed, then months. They lived simply, waking with the sun and resting when the day dimmed to soft dusk. Charles taught music to the village children. He repaired instruments, tuned violins, built new strings for broken harps. Geneviève tended a small garden beside the cottage, took in mending from neighbors, and taught reading to the vintner's daughter. Her hands grew strong again, but the calluses returned differently this time, earned by soil, not servitude. Some days they didn't speak until afternoon. Some days they rose laughing. Some days they didn't leave the cottage at all. The days layered over each other like pages in a book she hadn't known she was writing. She played often, in the evenings, on a small harpsichord salvaged from the back of an old farmhouse. It had been broken when Charles found it, half its keys missing, the lacquer peeled from the frame, but he repaired it slowly, day by day, until it sang again. She didn't play Mozart at first. She played what came to her fingers, songs that had no name, melodies that grew from memory and dream. She filled the room with warmth and silence and sound, and Charles sat beside her, sometimes reading, sometimes listening, always close. In the late winter, a parcel arrived. It was wrapped in simple linen, tied with twine, bearing no return name, only a seal, a rose, pressed in deep crimson wax. Inside was a handwritten copy of the sonata she had played in the Rose Hall. Beneath the final measure, a note. For the woman who played truth into silence. Geneviève folded the note once and pressed it to her chest. Then she tucked it inside her notebook, between the pages of her own composition. That night, she played the sonata again. It sounded different now. Not because she had changed the phrasing, but because she no longer played for approval. She played for remembrance, for clarity, for everything that had been lost and everything she had reclaimed. Charles stood in the doorway and listened. When she finished, he came to her and knelt beside the bench, lifting her hand to his lips. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and closed her eyes. They remained like that for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, stirring the lavender. Inside, the fire glowed low in the hearth, steady and warm. They had left behind a kingdom of marble and shadows and found something else, something smaller, quieter, but no less noble. Love, finally, without pretense or condition. And in the hush that followed the last note, they knew they had come home. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.